The train from Butte arrived in Helena on the morning of October 14, 1902, carrying one passenger who should not have been traveling alone. His name was Samuel Garrett. He was 23 years old. He had left Helena 6 weeks earlier in the company of 4 men bound for a surveying contract in the Bitterroot Range. He returned with a canvas pack, a surveyor's transit wrapped in oilcloth, and nothing else. No explanation, no bodies, no locations. The station master, a man named Howell who had known Samuel since childhood, would later tell the county attorney that the young man stepped off the train like he was made of stone. Howell asked where the others were. Samuel looked at him. Howell was specific about this, repeating it in 3 separate depositions, and said only, "They're not coming back." Then he walked home. His mother, Ida Garrett, a widow who ran a boarding house on Rodney Street, opened the door to find her son standing on the porch in clothes that had been worn for weeks without washing. She embraced him. He did not return it. She asked him what had happened. He said he needed to sleep. He slept for 16 hours. When he woke, his mother had already sent word to the families of the missing men. By noon, there were 7 people in her parlor, 2 mothers, 1 father, 3 siblings, a fiancé. Samuel sat in a chair by the window and said nothing. The fiancée, a woman named Clara Hobbs, engaged to a man named Thomas Ridley, knelt in front of him and took his hands. Witnesses said she spoke softly, almost in a whisper. She asked if Thomas was alive. Samuel looked at her for a long time, then he said, "No." She asked how he died. Samuel withdrew his hands and turned his face to the window. He did not answer her question, not that day, not ever. There is a photograph of Samuel Garrett taken in 1901, 1 year before the disappearance. It sits now in the archives of the Montana Historical Society, donated by a distant relative in 1968. In it, he stands beside his surveying equipment, one hand resting on the tripod, his expression calm and open. He is clean-shaven, slender, with dark hair parted neatly to one side. He looks directly at the camera. There is no wariness in him yet. By all accounts, he was an ordinary young man. He had apprenticed under his father, a railroad surveyor who died of pneumonia in 1898. After his father's death, Samuel took over the small contracts his father had left behind: boundary surveys, timber estimates, township plats. He was known to be competent, quiet, and reliable. He did not drink. He attended the Episcopal Church irregularly. He had no romantic entanglements and no debts. He was, in the language of that time and place, unremarkable. The 4 men who accompanied him into the mountains were similarly unremarkable. Thomas Ridley, 26, a carpenter. Virgil Kemp, 31, a day laborer. Edward Moss, 28, the son of a feed store owner. And James Latimer, 41, a former schoolteacher who had worked sporadically as a camp cook. They were hired through Samuel, who had secured a contract from the Northern Pacific Railway to survey a potential spur line through the southern Bitterroots. The work was expected to take 4 to 6 weeks. The pay was modest, but steady. None of the men had families to support, except Ridley, who was saving to marry Clara Hobbs in the spring. They left Helena on the 2nd of September, 1902, carrying surveying equipment, provisions for 2 months, 3 rifles, and a mule named Juno. Samuel Garrett returned alone 42 days later. The mule did not return. In the days following his return, pressure mounted. The families demanded answers. The county attorney, a man named Phineas Cobb, visited the Garrett home on October 16th and again on October 18th. He asked Samuel to provide a statement. Samuel refused. Cobb noted in his private journal, later acquired by the Montana State Archives, that Samuel was composed to the point of unsettling rigidity. He did not appear grief-stricken. He did not appear traumatized. He simply offered no information. When Cobb pressed him on the legal obligation to report deaths, Samuel said only, "I'm not reporting deaths. I'm reporting that they're gone." Cobb asked if he knew where the bodies were. Samuel said, "Yes." Cobb asked if he would take authorities to the location. Samuel said, "No." This refusal was not hysterical. It was not evasive. It was absolute. Cobb considered charging him with obstruction, but there was no body, no evidence of foul play, and no legal precedent for compelling a survivor to speak. The case remained open but dormant. Search parties were organized by the families and a few volunteers, but the Bitterroot Range is vast and unforgiving. Without direction, they found nothing. Samuel Garrett resumed his work. Within 3 weeks, he had accepted a new surveying contract in the Tobacco Root Mountains, this time traveling alone. His mother begged him not to go. He went anyway. Over the next 28 years, he would complete more than 60 surveys across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. He worked alone. He spoke little. He never married. And he never spoke about what happened in the Bitterroots. There is one documented moment when Samuel came close. It occurred in the spring of 1904, nearly 2 years after the disappearance. Clara Hobbs, still unmarried, still grieving Thomas Ridley, encountered Samuel on the steps of the Lewis and Clark County Courthouse. She had gone there to finalize the legal declaration of Thomas's death, a necessary step to settle his modest estate. A clerk named Morton Sills witnessed the encounter and described it in a letter to his sister, now held in a private collection in Missoula. Clara approached Samuel directly. She did not touch him. She stood 3 feet away and said, "I need to know if he suffered." Samuel stopped. Sills wrote that he looked at her as if she had struck him. She repeated the question, "Did Thomas suffer?" Samuel opened his mouth, then closed it. Then he said very quietly, "I can't tell you that." Clara asked why. Samuel's exact words as recorded by Sills were, "Because if I tell you, you'll have to carry it too." Then he walked away. Clara did not pursue him. She stood on the courthouse steps, Sills wrote, weeping without sound. She married a railroad clerk in 1906 and moved to Spokane. She never returned to Helena. In a diary entry from 1911, discovered after her death in 1954, she wrote, "I think Samuel Garrett knew something worse than death. I think that's why he wouldn't say." By 1910, Samuel had become a figure of local whisper. People in Helena still spoke of the 4 men who went into the mountains and never returned, but Samuel himself was rarely discussed openly. He was known in the way that strange and solitary men are known in small western towns, by reputation, by rumor, by the deliberate absence of detail. He lived with his mother until her death in 1913. After that, he rented a room above a dry goods store on Last Chance Gulch. He kept no close friends. He attended church occasionally, but sat alone in the back pew. He was polite to shopkeepers, prompt with rent, and invisible in all other respects. There is no record of him ever socializing, no record of him drinking in a saloon, attending a dance, or joining a fraternal lodge. He worked, he returned to his room, and he read. His landlord, a man named Ira Tunney, later told a WPA interviewer in 1937 that Samuel owned maybe 30 books, all of them on geology or mathematics or history. Not a novel in the bunch. Tunney also noted that Samuel never had visitors, not once in 17 years. The last serious attempt to make Samuel speak occurred in 1919. Virgil Kemp's younger brother, a man named Roland, who had been 12 years old at the time of the disappearance, returned to Montana after serving in the Great War. He had been wounded at Belleau Wood and walked with a cane. He had also, by multiple accounts, become obsessed with learning what had happened to his brother. Roland Kemp found Samuel at a survey site near Boulder. He confronted him in front of a crew of railroad workers. The foreman, a man named Lyle Crutchfield, described the incident in a report filed with the Northern Pacific Railway. Roland demanded to know where Virgil was buried. Samuel said he didn't know. Roland called him a liar. Samuel said nothing. Roland struck him across the face with his cane. Samuel did not defend himself. He stood there, blood running from his nose, and said, "I'm sorry." Roland struck him again. The crew pulled him back. Samuel walked to his tent, gathered his equipment, and left the site. He forfeited 3 weeks of pay. Roland Kemp died by his own hand in 1921. He left no note. Samuel Garrett's silence became, over time, a kind of monument. It was not the silence of trauma, though trauma was surely present. It was not the silence of guilt, though others believed it must be. It was a chosen silence, willful, unyielding. He carried what he knew the way a man carries a sealed letter he will never open. And in 1930, at the age of 51, he died of a heart attack in a boarding house in Bozeman. He was found by the landlady, slumped in a chair with a book open on his lap. The book was a geological survey of the Bitterroot Range, published in 1897. There was no will, no family, no personal correspondence. His few possessions were sold to cover burial costs. Among them was a small leather notebook, the kind surveyors used for field notes. It contained only measurements, coordinates, and sketches of terrain. The final entry was dated September 28, 1902, 16 days before Samuel returned to Helena. The rest of the pages had been torn out. To understand what Samuel Garrett refused to say, one must first understand what the five men were to each other before the silence. They were not friends, not in any deep sense, but they were familiar. They trusted each other in the limited functional way that working men trust each other, enough to share a campfire, to divide labor, to rely on competence. Samuel had worked with Thomas Ridley on 2 previous surveys, both minor township plats in the Helena Valley. Ridley was the kind of man people liked immediately. He laughed easily, he told stories. He had grown up on a farm near Townsend and still carried the open, unguarded manner of someone who had never been given reason to distrust the world. Clara Hobbs, in a letter to her sister written in 1903, described Thomas as the sort of man who makes you feel the day is better simply because he's in it. They had met at a church social in 1900. He proposed to her in the summer of 1902, 3 weeks before leaving for the Bitterroots. He was 26. He had saved $140 for the wedding. Virgil Kemp was harder to know. He had worked on the railroad for 8 years, mostly as a section hand, repairing track in all weather. He was a large man, over 6 feet tall, with hands that Clara Hobbs once described, second-hand from something Thomas had told her, as like pieces of machinery. He did not speak much, but when he did, it was with care. His younger brother, Roland, remembered him as someone who thought before every sentence, like words cost money. Virgil had never married. He lived in a boarding house on State Street and sent most of his wages to his mother, who was ill and living with Roland's family in Deer Lodge. He had signed on for the Bitterroot survey because the pay was better than railroad work, and because Samuel Garrett had a reputation for finishing contracts on time. He was 31 years old. He had no debts and no dreams anyone knew about. Edward Moss was the youngest son of a feed store owner, a man who had done well enough to send Edward to a business college in Butte for 2 years. Edward returned to Helena in 1899 with a certificate in bookkeeping and no interest in using it. He worked intermittently, warehouse jobs, freight loading, occasional carpentry. His father, Bernard Moss, considered him lazy. His mother, Catherine, considered him restless. In truth, Edward seems to have been searching for something he could not name. He read constantly. He subscribed to Scientific American and National Geographic. He kept a journal, though no entries from before 1902 survive. His younger sister, Margaret, told a WPA interviewer in 1938 that Edward once said he wanted to see something no one else had seen. When Samuel Garrett hired him for the Bitterroot survey, Edward asked if the route would take them into uncharted territory. Samuel said it might. Edward signed on immediately. He was 28 years old. James Latimer was the oldest of the group and the least understood. He had been a school teacher in Minnesota for 7 years before moving to Montana in 1896. No one knew why he left teaching. He never spoke of it. He worked as a camp cook for logging crews, ore prospectors, and survey teams. He was known to be a good cook and a solitary man. He had been married once. His wife had died in childbirth in 1894. The child died as well. After that, he stopped teaching and began moving west. There are no photographs of James Latimer. There are no letters in his hand. What little is known of him comes from the memories of people who worked alongside him and remembered almost nothing. A logging foreman named Hugh Danner told an interviewer in 1935 that Latimer was the kind of man who could sit with you for hours and you'd forget he was there. Samuel Garrett hired him because he needed a cook and because Latimer had worked in the Bitterroots before. He knew the terrain. He knew what to pack. He was 41 years old. The 5 men gathered at Samuel Garrett's mother's boarding house on the evening of September 1st, 1902. Ida Garrett prepared a meal for them. Roast chicken, boiled potatoes, carrots, bread. She later told the county attorney that the men were in good spirits. They spoke of the route, the weather, the pay. Thomas Ridley teased Virgil Kemp about the size of his pack. Edward Moss showed Samuel a new compass he had purchased. James Latimer sat quietly and ate. Ida said that Samuel seemed preoccupied, but not worried. He was always serious before a survey, she told Cobb. He liked to have everything planned. After the meal, the men loaded their supplies onto a wagon borrowed from the feed store. They would take it as far as the rail station, then transfer everything to a freight car bound for Derby. From there, they would proceed on foot and by mule into the mountains. Clara Hobbs came to say goodbye to Thomas. They stood on the porch. She gave him a small leather-bound Bible. He promised to write. She never received a letter. The last confirmed sighting of the 5 men together occurred on September 4th, 1902, at a trading post near the Bitterroot River, roughly 12 miles south of Derby. The post was operated by a man named Cyrus Hale, a former trapper who sold provisions to loggers, prospectors, and hunters. In a statement given to the county attorney in October 1902, Hale described the men as ordinary and unremarkable. They purchased tobacco, matches, and an additional 50 pounds of flour. Samuel Garrett consulted with Hale about the route they intended to take. Hale advised against it. He said the terrain west of Lost Horse Creek was bad country, not because of bears or weather, but because men got turned around in there. Samuel thanked him for the advice and said they would be cautious. Hale noted that all 5 men seemed healthy and well supplied. He saw no signs of conflict or tension among them. He wrote in his ledger that they paid in full and left heading west. That was the last time anyone other than Samuel Garrett saw the 4 men alive. What happened in the mountains is unknowable in any complete sense, but there are fragments, traces, small pieces of evidence that suggest the journey proceeded normally for at least 2 weeks. A hunter named Dale Pritchard encountered the group on September 11th, roughly 30 miles into the Bitterroots. He was tracking elk and crossed paths with them near a stream. He did not speak with them at length, but he later told the county attorney that they appeared to be in good health. He saw no signs of illness, injury, or distress. He also noted that they were moving slowly. Surveying, he said, always slow. On September 17th, a prospector named Angus McKinnon found a survey stake driven into the ground near a ridge above Lost Horse Creek. The stake was marked with Samuel Garrett's initials and a date, September 16th, 1902. This places the group at least 40 miles into the Bitterroots, deep in unmapped country. After that, there is nothing. No witnesses, no stakes, no trace of the 5 men until Samuel Garrett reappeared in Butte on October 13th, alone. The families, in the immediate aftermath, wanted to believe something comprehensible had happened. An accident, a rock slide, a fall. Something that could be explained and in some small way accepted. But Samuel's refusal to provide even basic information made that impossible. Did they die together or separately? He would not say. Were they buried? He would not say. Did he try to help them? He would not say. The uncertainty calcified into something worse than grief. It became a kind of haunting. Bernard Moss, Edward's father, told a reporter from the Helena Independent in 1903 that not knowing was like having a door in your mind that won't close. He would die in 1908, still not knowing. There is one detail from the time before the disappearance that, in retrospect, carries weight. In late August 1902, 2 weeks before the survey began, Samuel Garrett visited the Helena Public Library. The librarian, a woman named Edith Crane, noted in her daily log that Samuel checked out 3 books: a geological survey of the Rocky Mountains, a manual on wilderness survival, and a collection of Native American oral histories from the Pacific Northwest. He returned the first 2 books on schedule. He never returned the third. In 1927, 25 years later, the book was found among Samuel's possessions after his mother's estate was settled. It was heavily annotated. Samuel had underlined passages about sacred places, forbidden territories, and stories of men who entered the mountains and were changed by what they saw. One passage, in a chapter on Salish traditions, was marked with a piece of paper on which Samuel had written a single sentence in pencil: "Some places do not want to be surveyed." The handwriting was confirmed to be his. Reconstructing the last confirmed moment the 5 men were together requires inference, testimony from peripheral witnesses, and the few physical traces that survive. What is certain is this: by mid-September 1902, the group had penetrated deep into the Bitterroot Range, following a route that would have taken them along ridgelines and through narrow valleys west of Lost Horse Creek. The terrain there is steep, forested, and disorienting. Even experienced outdoorsmen can lose their sense of direction within hours. Samuel Garrett was an experienced outdoorsman. He did not get lost. There is a map. It was discovered in 1911, 9 years after the disappearance, by a forest ranger named Caleb Stone. He found it wedged beneath a rock on a high ridge approximately 50 miles west of Derby, far beyond where any survey would reasonably have taken the group. The map was hand-drawn on a piece of canvas, badly weathered but legible. It depicted a section of the Bitterroots with rough annotations in Samuel Garrett's handwriting. The annotations included coordinates, elevation estimates, and notations about water sources. At the center of the map, Samuel had drawn a circle. Inside the circle, he had written 2 words: "Do not." That was all. The map was submitted as evidence to the county attorney, but by 1911 the case had long been dormant. No further investigation was conducted. The map remains in the Montana State Archives, preserved in a flat file with other unclaimed materials from unsolved cases. Historians have speculated endlessly about what the circle marked: a dangerous area, a site of death, a place Samuel believed should not be entered. There is no way to know. But the map suggests that at some point, Samuel Garrett marked a boundary, and he marked it with a warning. The mule, Juno, never returned. This detail is significant. Mules are expensive, they are also survivable. A mule can escape a predator, flee a rock slide, wander away from a camp and be recovered later. The fact that Juno did not return suggests one of 2 things: either the mule died, or Samuel released it deliberately. If the mule died, it likely died with the men. Mules do not abandon a group unless forced to. They are pack animals oriented toward routine and companionship. If the men were killed by an accident, a fall, a landslide, the mule would have remained nearby or returned to the last known camp. But if Samuel released the mule, that suggests intention. It suggests he chose to leave the mountains alone, unencumbered, and that whatever happened to the others had already happened. The Northern Pacific Railway, which had contracted the survey, filed a claim for the loss of the mule. The claim was denied. The mule's value was listed as $45. There is one testimony that describes Samuel Garrett's physical condition when he arrived in Butte on October 13, 1902. The testimony comes from a physician named Dr. Leonard Marsh, who examined Samuel at the request of the county attorney 3 days after his return. Dr. Marsh's notes, preserved in the Lewis and Clark County records, describe Samuel as gaunt but not malnourished, dehydrated but not dangerously so, and exhibiting signs of prolonged exertion. Marsh noted several abrasions on Samuel's hands and forearms, consistent with rough travel through forested terrain. He also noted bruising along Samuel's ribs and a partially healed cut above his left eye. When Marsh asked how he had sustained these injuries, Samuel said, "Falling." Marsh pressed him. He asked if Samuel had fallen once or multiple times. Samuel said, "I don't remember." Marsh wrote in his notes, "Patient exhibits no signs of head trauma or confusion. Evasion appears deliberate." Marsh also noted that Samuel's clothes, though filthy, showed no signs of blood other than his own. This suggested that whatever had happened to the other men, Samuel had not been present for it, or had not been close enough to be marked by it. One additional detail from Dr. Marsh's examination is worth noting. Marsh asked Samuel if he had eaten in the days before his return. Samuel said he had. Marsh asked what he had eaten. Samuel hesitated, then said, "What I could find." Marsh asked if he had hunted. Samuel said, "No." Marsh asked if he had consumed the group's remaining provisions. Samuel said, "There were no provisions." Marsh did not pursue this line of questioning further, but he noted in his report that Samuel's weight loss was consistent with approximately 2 weeks of limited caloric intake. If the survey had left Helena with 2 months of provisions, and if Samuel had returned after 42 days, the provisions should not have been exhausted. This implies one of several possibilities. The provisions were lost. They were consumed by all 5 men before the others died. Or Samuel left the provisions behind, deliberately. Each possibility suggests a different sequence of events. None of them were ever confirmed. The last known written words of any of the 5 men come from a letter Thomas Ridley sent to Clara Hobbs. The letter was posted from Derby on September 6, 1902, 2 days after the group left Cyrus Hale's trading post. It arrived in Helena on September 11th. The letter is brief and cheerful. Thomas writes about the beauty of the mountains, the quality of the weather, and his confidence that the survey will be completed on time. He mentions Samuel Garrett's thoroughness. He mentions that Edward Moss has been sketching the landscape in a notebook. He mentions that James Latimer's cooking is better than expected. He signs the letter, "Yours always, Thomas." There is no indication in the letter of anything wrong. Clara Hobbs kept the letter for the rest of her life. After her death in 1954, it was found pressed between the pages of her Bible, the same Bible she had given to Thomas on the night before he left. The Bible never made it back. There is one account of a conversation Samuel Garrett had in late September 1902, after his return, but before the pressure to speak had fully mounted. The account comes from a neighbor of Ida Garrett's, a woman named Phyllis Dawn, who lived 2 houses down on Rodney Street. Phyllis encountered Samuel on his front porch on the evening of September 20th. She greeted him. He nodded. She asked, carefully, if he was all right. Samuel said, "I'm here." She asked if there was anything she could do. Samuel looked at her for a long moment, then said, "Do you believe some places don't want people in them?" Phyllis, confused, asked what he meant. Samuel said, "Nothing, I'm sorry." He went inside. Phyllis recounted this conversation to Ida Garrett the next day. Ida dismissed it as exhaustion, but Phyllis told the story again in 1919 to a reporter from the Helena Independent who was writing a retrospective on the disappearance. By then, Phyllis had come to believe Samuel had been trying to tell her something. "He was asking permission to stay quiet," she said. "That's what I think now." The separation, whatever it was, occurred sometime between September 16th, when the survey stake was planted, and October 13th, when Samuel Garrett appeared alone in Butte. That is a span of 27 days. Samuel could have walked the distance from the survey site to Butte in 7 days, perhaps less. That leaves 20 days unaccounted for. 20 days in which 4 men died and 1 man survived. 20 days in which Samuel Garrett made a decision not to speak. The county attorney, Phineas Cobb, in a private letter to a colleague in 1904, wrote, "I do not believe Garrett killed those men, but I believe he watched them die, and I believe whatever he watched was something he could not reconcile with the world, as it is supposed to be." Cobb never elaborated on what he meant by that, but it suggests he suspected something beyond accident, beyond comprehension. The silence became its own form of testimony. In the weeks and months following Samuel Garrett's return, the absence of information took on a shape. Negative space that people filled with speculation, anger, and eventually a kind of weary acceptance. There were theories. Some believed Samuel had killed the others. The families never believed this. There was no motive, no history of violence, no evidence, but strangers did. A man named Porter Lyle, who ran a saloon on Last Chance Gulch, told patrons in late 1902 that Samuel had the look of a man with blood on his hands. When pressed for what he meant by the look, Lyle admitted he had never spoken to Samuel directly. Others believed the men had died in an accident and that Samuel, traumatized, simply could not speak of it. This was the most charitable interpretation, and the one Ida Garrett clung to for the rest of her life. In a letter to her sister in 1905, she wrote, "Samuel is not cruel, he is broken. Whatever he saw broke something in him that cannot be mended." Still, others believed Samuel had made a promise, that one or more of the dying men had asked him not to reveal how they died, and that he was honoring that request. This theory gained traction in 1907, when a former prospector named Eli Coombs published an editorial in the Helena Independent arguing that a man's last words are sacred, and if Garrett was told not to speak, then silence is the only moral path. Clara Hobbs read the editorial and wrote a letter to the editor in response. The letter was never published, but a draft survives in her personal papers. In it, she wrote, "If Thomas asked Samuel to be silent, then I must live with that. But I do not believe Thomas would ask me to suffer not knowing. I do not believe any of them would." She was 24 years old when she wrote that letter. She never stopped trying to understand. The families, over time, fractured. Bernard Moss, Edward's father, could not accept the silence. He became convinced that Samuel was lying, that there was a simple explanation being withheld out of cowardice or guilt. He hired a private investigator in 1904, a man named Jonas Pruitt, who had worked for the Pinkerton Agency, and sent him into the Bitterroots to search for evidence. Pruitt returned after 6 weeks with nothing. He told Bernard Moss that the mountains had swallowed the story whole. Bernard paid him $50 and never hired another investigator. In 1906, he stopped attending church. In 1907, he began drinking. In 1908, he died of liver failure, 53 years old, having spent the last 6 years of his life trying to force an answer from a man who would not give one. Virgil Kemp's mother, a woman named Opal, took a different path. She wrote to Samuel Garrett once in the winter of 1903. The letter was brief. She did not ask what had happened. She asked only if Virgil had spoken of her before he died. Samuel did not respond. Opal wrote a second letter. She asked if Virgil had been afraid. Samuel did not respond. She wrote a third letter. This one was longer. In it, she said she did not blame Samuel for surviving. She said she only wanted to know if her son had been alone at the end, or if someone had been with him. Samuel sent a reply. It was a single sentence. He was not alone. Opal Kemp carried that letter with her until her death in 1920. It was buried with her. James Latimer had no family to press for answers. His wife and child were dead. His parents were dead. He had one brother who lived in Ohio and had not spoken to him in a decade. When the county attorney attempted to contact the brother in late 1902, he received a letter in response, stating, "James made his choices. I have no interest in his fate." James Latimer disappeared from the world twice, once in the Bitterroots and once from memory. There is no grave, no memorial, no one left to mourn him. The pressure on Samuel Garrett to speak reached its peak in the spring of 1903. The families, led by Clara Hobbs and Bernard Moss, petitioned the county attorney to charge Samuel with obstruction of justice. The petition was denied on the grounds that no crime had been proven. They petitioned the territorial governor to order an inquest. The petition was denied. They hired a lawyer, a man named Gregory Stills, who argued that Samuel's refusal to disclose the location of the bodies violated common decency, if not common law. Stills brought the matter before a judge, who ruled that while Samuel's silence was morally troubling, it was not illegal. Stills told the families there was nothing more he could do. Clara Hobbs, according to her diary, wept for 3 days. There was one moment when it seemed Samuel might break. It occurred in the summer of 1903, nearly a year after the disappearance. Samuel was working on a survey near Elliston, about 30 miles northwest of Helena. He was staying at a small inn run by a woman named Ada Finch, who later recounted the incident to her daughter, who in turn recounted it to a WPA interviewer in 1936. According to Ada, Samuel returned to the inn one evening after a long day in the field. He sat at the dinner table alone, there were no other guests, and Ada served him a plate of stew. She sat down across from him, something she rarely did, and asked if he was all right. Samuel said he was. Ada, who was known for her directness, said, "You don't look all right. You look like a man carrying something heavy." Samuel stopped eating. He looked at her. Ada said his expression was not angry, not sad, just tired. Then he said, "If I put it down, someone else will have to pick it up." Ada asked what he meant. Samuel did not answer. He finished his meal, paid, and went to his room. The next morning, he was gone. Over the next several years, Samuel Garrett became a kind of ghost in his own life. He worked constantly. He took contracts in remote areas, places where he would encounter few people and be asked few questions. He slept in tents, in line shacks, in the corners of barns. He did not settle anywhere. In 1907, he worked a survey near the Idaho border and stayed in a logging camp for 2 weeks. The camp foreman, a man named Dutch Harmon, later told an interviewer that Samuel didn't talk, didn't drink, didn't complain, just worked, like a machine. Harmon also said that Samuel never built a fire at night, even when it was cold. He would sit outside his tent in the dark, fully dressed, staring at nothing. I asked him once why he didn't light a fire. Harmon said, "He told me he didn't like what fire showed him. I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer." In 1913, Ida Garrett died of influenza. Samuel returned to Helena for the funeral. It was the first time he had been seen in the town in nearly 2 years. He stood at the back of the church during the service. He did not speak to anyone. He left immediately after the burial. Clara Hobbs attended the funeral. She saw Samuel leave. She did not approach him. In her diary that night she wrote, "I saw Samuel today. He looks older than he should. I wonder if he sleeps. I wonder if he ever did." By 1920, the story of the 4 missing men had faded from public memory. The families had moved on, or died, or simply stopped asking. The case remained technically open but was never actively investigated. Samuel Garrett, now 41 years old, had become a fixture of the Montana surveying trade, respected for his accuracy, known for his silence, and entirely alone. He owned nothing. He saved little. He lived out of a canvas pack and a bedroll. There is no record of him ever taking a day off. There is one final documented instance of someone trying to make Samuel speak. It occurred in 1925, 23 years after the disappearance. A young journalist named Martin Kessler, working for the Billings Gazette, became interested in the story after reading a brief mention of it in an old issue of the Helena Independent. Kessler tracked Samuel down to a survey site near Red Lodge and approached him with a notebook and a list of prepared questions. Samuel was 56 years old by then. Kessler described him as lean, weathered, and utterly unremarkable in appearance, save for his eyes, which were the eyes of a man who had stopped expecting anything from other people. Kessler asked Samuel if he would answer questions about the 1902 disappearance. Samuel said, "No." Kessler asked if he had ever considered telling the families what happened. Samuel said, "Every day." Kessler, surprised, asked why he hadn't. Samuel looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Because knowing would be worse." Kessler pressed. He asked how it could be worse than not knowing. Samuel said, "You'd be surprised." Then he walked away. Kessler never wrote the story. In a letter to his editor, he explained, "I don't think Garrett is protecting himself. I think he's protecting everyone else." Samuel Garrett died on March 8, 1930, in a rented room in Bozeman. He was 51 years old. The cause of death was a heart attack. He was found by his landlady, a woman named Ruth Collier, who had rented to him for 3 months without learning anything about him beyond his name and his profession. She told the county coroner that Samuel had been polite, quiet, and entirely forgettable. There was no funeral, no obituary. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Bozeman City Cemetery. The plot was paid for by the county. Among his possessions, a surveyor's transit, a bedroll, 4 changes of clothes, a shaving kit, $37 in cash, and the leather notebook with the torn-out pages. There was also a letter. It was addressed to no one. It was not sealed. It was found in the notebook, folded once. The letter contained 3 sentences, written in Samuel's precise handwriting. I did not kill them. I could not save them, and I will not say what I saw. That was all. The letter is preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives. It has been analyzed by handwriting experts, historians, and amateur investigators. It has been cited in articles, books, and documentaries, but it answers nothing. It only confirms the silence. More than a century has passed since Samuel Garrett returned from the Bitterroots alone. The 4 men he left behind, Thomas Ridley, Virgil Kemp, Edward Moss, and James Latimer, remain officially missing. Their case, filed as open inactive in the Lewis and Clark County records, has never been closed. No bodies have ever been recovered. No physical evidence has ever been found. No explanation has ever been given. And yet, Samuel Garrett's silence tells us something. It tells us that whatever happened in those mountains was not a simple accident. Accidents can be described. They can be located. They leave evidence, bodies, belongings, traces of struggle or misfortune. Samuel's refusal to provide even the most basic information, where the men died, how they died, whether they were buried, suggests he believed that knowing was dangerous. Not dangerous in a legal sense, not dangerous in a physical sense, dangerous in some other way. There are patterns in Samuel's life after 1902 that suggest the silence was not evasion, but protection. He continued to work as a surveyor, which meant he continued to enter the wilderness alone. If he had been traumatized by the mountains, one would expect avoidance. Instead, he returned to them again and again, as if testing himself, or as if searching for something. He never married, never formed close relationships, never allowed anyone into his life in a meaningful way. This was not misanthropy. By all accounts, Samuel was polite, reliable, and pleasant in his interactions. He simply kept everyone at a distance. This suggests he believed that closeness would require disclosure, and disclosure he believed was unacceptable. When Opal Kemp asked if her son had been alone at the end, Samuel told her that Virgil had not been alone. This implies Samuel was there. It implies he witnessed the deaths, and yet he would not, could not, describe them. When Clara Hobbs asked if Thomas had suffered, Samuel said, "If I tell you, you'll have to carry it too." This is the language of burden, of unbearable knowledge. Samuel was not protecting himself. He was protecting others from knowing what he knew. What did he know? There are theories. Some believe the men stumbled into a sacred or forbidden place, a site of spiritual significance that should not have been entered. The Salish people, who have lived in and around the Bitterroots for thousands of years, have oral traditions about certain valleys and ridges that are avoided. These places are not marked. They are known through story, passed down through generations. To enter them uninvited is to invite consequences. Samuel's annotation in the Book of Native American Oral Histories, "Some places do not want to be surveyed," lends weight to this interpretation. But it does not explain how the men died, or why Samuel believed speaking of it would harm others. Other theories suggest a natural disaster of some kind, a rockslide, a sudden flood, a cave-in, but none of these explain why Samuel would refuse to provide the location of the bodies, or why he would describe knowing as worse than not knowing. Still others believe the men encountered another person or group in the mountains, outlaws perhaps, or a hermit, and that what followed was so brutal, so disturbing, that Samuel could not reconcile it with the world he had known. But Samuel said he did not kill them, and there is no evidence he lied. The historian confronts in the end an absence. Not the absence of the 4 men, though that absence is profound. The absence of testimony. Samuel Garrett chose not to speak, not because he could not. He was articulate, composed, and fully capable of providing a statement, but because he believed silence was the correct response to what he had experienced. This is not the silence of trauma. in which memory is fractured or repressed. This is the silence of intention, of will. Samuel remembered. He chose not to share. And in choosing silence, he transformed his survival into a kind of monument, not to himself, but to the 4 men who died. He carried their deaths for 28 years without relief, without confession, without the comfort of being believed. He carried it alone, because he believed that was the only way to carry it. There is one final document worth considering. In 1937, 5 years after Samuel's death, a forest ranger named Thomas Whitley reported finding a cairn, a stack of stones, on a high ridge west of Lost Horse Creek. The cairn was not marked, there was no inscription. But buried beneath the stones, Whitley found a rusted surveyor's stake. The stake was marked with Samuel Garrett's initials and a date, September 28, 1902. Whitley reported the find to the Forest Service, which filed a brief note in its records. The cairn was noted as a historical curiosity and left undisturbed. In 1954, a second ranger conducting a survey of the same area attempted to locate the cairn. He could not find it. The terrain had changed. Erosion, weather, time. The cairn is gone now. But for a period of years it existed. A silent marker in a place no one goes, built by a man who refused to say why. Samuel Garrett's silence was not a refusal to remember. It was a refusal to transfer the burden. He believed, he must have believed, that some knowledge is too heavy to share, that some truths once spoken cannot be unheard, that the families already grieving would be destroyed not by the absence of information, but by its presence. This is not cowardice, this is a kind of terrible mercy. Samuel chose to carry what he saw alone, to let it die with him, so that others could live without it. And he succeeded. The 4 men remain missing. The silence remains unbroken. And whatever Samuel Garrett saw in the Bitterroots in the fall of 1902 has been erased from the world. Not by time, not by the mountains, by Samuel himself. There is a photograph of the Bitterroot Range taken in 1925, near the area where the survey would have taken Samuel and the others. The photograph is black and white, slightly overexposed. It shows a high ridge, steep and forested, with clouds gathering above. In the foreground, barely visible, is a cairn of stones. The photograph is preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives. It is filed under unidentified landmarks. No one knows who built the cairn. No one knows what it marks. But it is there, a silent monument to silence.